Hello, and welcome to the third and final day of Thoughtworks Live 2020. As many of you know, Thoughtworks Live is a conference designed for senior executives at the intersection of business and technology. And our themes are carefully designed to explore how to take advantage of the almost infinite possibilities created by the exponential advancements in technology. In this edition, our guest speakers have examined how leaders can create value from volatility and transform their organizations for the reality of constant change. Today, I'm genuinely delighted to be joined by Ben Davison. Ben is the Executive Director for Product Development at NHS Digital, the National Information and Technology Partner for the Health and Care Service. Ben has kindly agreed to step in for Sarah Wilkinson, who, as you may already know, is unable to join us today due to unforeseen circumstances. Welcome, Ben, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
More than a pleasure. So firstly, perhaps you could tell us a bit about your role at NHS Digital and how that's evolved in light of the pandemic.
My role is, I'm Exec Director of Product Development at NHS Digital, and I think product development is potentially a slightly misleading term. So it's probably more akin to what you would classically describe as a director of programs or a director of transformation. Clearly, developing products and services is a key part of that. But what we do is much more than just developing new products. So broadly, I'm responsible for, I think, 5 areas. So the first area is what we call citizen health technology. So those are all our citizen-facing services, such as the NHS website, the NHS app, the citizen-facing identity management services. So that's the first area. The second area is all the services that we do for urgent and emergency care. And these, again, tend to be the national services that the NHS uses. So within there, we have things such as the 111 online service, and I expect that we'll talk some more about that later, given the work that Thoughtworks did to help us with that during the crisis. But in addition to that, we have our clinical algorithm tools and a number of other areas in there as well. So that's number 2. The third area is around screening services. So we design and build screening services that underpin cancer. We will be creating the strategic screening platform for breast and other types of bowel, other types of cancer going forwards. Fourth area is primary care. So we operate frameworks for primary care providers such as EMIS and TPP and others to interact with each other and interact with the national systems, including helping those providers bring new products to market in a safe way. And the final area of my responsibility is around transforming the way that we operate within the product development directorate. So I joined the organization in January, and my background has typically been around setting up large software organizations and helping large-scale transformation programs that had found themselves in difficulties. And typically, the journey that we'd been on in helping to improve performance in those areas was around moving them from a projects mindset into thinking more about products and services, helping them to accelerate their delivery cadence and their release cadence, and helping to shift from a focus on delivering things to delivering kind of business outcomes. So I joined in January to help implement that shift across the directorate as a whole. In some areas we're really strong at that. In other areas we needed to make improvements, and it's understandable as to why that would be required. So we are talking about large-scale clinical systems here. So they're not things that are easy to iterate around very, very quickly. They have to go through very rigorous assurance regime. So encouraging them to move fast is a mindset shift that we needed to take the organization on. So those are my areas of responsibility. I guess the second part of your question was around how those responsibilities have changed as a result of the pandemic. Well, I think probably the honest answer is that a lot of the work that we wanted to do over the course of this financial year and next financial year has fundamentally been short-circuited by the pandemic. So we've rapidly made progress on some of the objectives that we set ourselves at the start of the year. So the majority of our services are now releasing software very, very quickly, much faster than they had done prior to the pandemic starting. And we've also learned a lot around how we need to design, build and manage our services for what are effectively unpredictable and uncontrollable kind of times. So that's really helped us move forward the agenda that we set ourselves at the start of the year, which was to effectively modernize the way that we deliver our services.
Thanks, Ben. COVID-19 caused an immense surge in patient demand for digital health services. And I guess just to give everyone watching an idea, NHS 111 online, the web version of the NHS 111 phone line, prior to COVID-19, used to have around 10,000 visits a day. From around mid-March, that number was closer to 1 million a day. Could you share with us how NHS Digital met that challenge?
Well, I think the honest answer is that, we didn't, initially. So I think we were first, caught a little bit by surprise when 111 appeared on the 6 o'clock news, and it had the URL on, a video on the news channel. We were expecting some publicity, and I think we'd scaled our service to cater for 20 times the level of kind of normal volume. But we were just not prepared for the sudden and instantaneous spike in volume that we received as a result of the publicity. And as you know, our 111 service went down. And given that, it was at the forefront of how patients were being asked to interact with NHS services, that was a big deal, at the time. So we had to, work very long hours over several weeks to try and build much more kind of fundamental resilience into that service to cater for kind of wild and sudden kind of fluctuations in demand. It's easy to create services that can cater for a gradual ramp up in volume, but when over 100 times your kind of volume appears kind of instantaneously, that's very difficult for you to cater for. So we learned a lot from that, and Thoughtworks helped us make sure that service was scalable going forwards. But it's a lesson that we learned as an organization. So it wasn't the only one of our services that was hit very, very hard during the pandemic. Given our services on our national systems, it's not surprising. And some of our services coped better than others in the early days. So, for example, the NHS website, it's used to a very high kind of traffic level on a daily basis that that catered for the increase in volumes and the focus without really breaking a sweat. But other services, so if I can call one out, we have our NHS login service, which is the citizen-facing identity management service. In the previous year, up until the COVID pandemic, they'd had 1 million registered users on that service. In the peak month during the pandemic, we had 500,000 registrations in 1 month. So we got in 1 month approximately half of what we'd experienced in the previous year, and our turnaround times on those kind of spiked and went through the roof. So we rapidly had to pilot in new levels of automation that we hadn't foreseen that we would need prior to the pandemic starting. But generally, that made us think then around how scalable and how resilient are our services, and can we do more to protect ourselves against what is essentially from an IT perspective, became ultimately a hostile environment where we didn't really have control of where the demand was coming from.
Obviously, the citizen-facing services are absolutely vital, but the surge in demand for healthcare technology was not just from a patient perspective, but also from the NHS organisations themselves. Could you share a little bit about some of the ways in which NHS helped streamline processes for other key services and for workers in the health sector? Yeah,
so I mean, we've talked a lot around the citizen-facing services, and it's being the front door to the NHS. It's natural that those were hit pretty hard during the initial stages of the pandemic, and those levels have stabilized, but albeit at an elevated level. But you're absolutely right. A lot of the work that we did in the months from February through to June and July was around enabling the NHS to work in a much more kind of distributed environment, and making sure that all areas of the service had relevant clinical information to hand, so that they could make decisions in ways that typically they couldn't do that beforehand. So just thinking about some of the things that we enabled during that period. So we have had a service that's been live for a while, which is called GP Connect, which allows GPs in one practice to see clinical records in another practice. Not necessarily difficult from an interoperability perspective, but we have to remember that the NHS is a complex organisation from a data and an information governance perspective. But with the changing in those regulations under COPI, the Control of Patient Information regulations under the pandemic, suddenly we found ourselves able to enable any GP in the country to view, or healthcare professional within a primary care setting, to be able to view patient records relating to any patient in the country. And in a world where we were preparing for GP practices to close, we were looking at centralisation of GP services in things like the National Pandemic Response Service. Mm-hmm. This was a fundamental improvement in the way that patient information could be shared across the NHS enterprise. On top of that, we had to enable people to work in a different way. So we played an important role in fast tracking through a number of services that the NHS could use in a more distributed manner to interact with patients. So, for example, we helped enable video consultations across primary care and secondary care. We looked at accelerating through our compliance frameworks, products around online consultations, so to allow patients to interact with primary care services, either through kind of decision tree formats to reduce the burden on primary care, or through allowing them to interact with patients through kind of chat type functionality. So there are lots of things that we did to enable the NHS to remain productive within the pandemic. Some of those things that we delivered, ultimately we didn't need to use extensively, but they will fundamentally give the NHS more flexibility going forwards in terms of the way that we can manage the service. So you're right, a lot of what we did was citizen facing, but we also fundamentally enabled the NHS to operate in different ways through allowing them to interact with patients in a distributed manner, and making sure that the information that clinicians would need was available to them, when typically that would not have been possible prior to the pandemic starting.
Right. I guess it was inevitable that we would talk about data. And, when people talk about success in a digital economy, often technology is the engine, but data is the fuel. And patient data and data sharing is playing a crucial role in managing the pandemic. Would you be able to talk to us about some of the ways in which data is being used, and maybe some of the learnings and improvements that you've had to implement along the way to get better data and better insight?
So I mentioned earlier that we are sharing data in a different way now across the NHS as an extended enterprise, and that includes both sharing data between NHS organisations, but we're also collecting different data centrally. Those are enabled under temporary legislation, the COPI legislation, but I think our aspiration is that some of those things will stick, and the service will see that there is great benefit in having data available at the point of care, regardless of where that data resides initially. So while some of these things will be temporary, we hope that some of them will remain longer term, because it fundamentally advances the anywhere to anywhere kind of agenda within the NHS, which has been a vision for digitisation in the NHS for as long as I've been involved over many years. NHS Digital has always played a statutory role in terms of collecting data sets from lots of different organisations within the NHS. So hospital episode statistics, we collect data from primary care, etc. So many different sort of data sets we collect. And typically our role has been to collect and to disseminate data as required. So we would harvest it and then send it out in anonymized or aggregated format to whoever needed it. I think where NHS Digital has found that it has a lot of value to add is in around the joining of some of those data sets that typically we haven't joined in the past. But going forwards, I think through some of the things that we've done during the crisis, I think we will increasingly be engaged in doing that. So I'll give you a couple of examples of where we have done that. So you may have heard of the shielded patients list. So this is a list of people that were invited to stay indoors for an extended period during the pandemic as a result of various different conditions that they had. So NHS Digital were fundamental in creating that list in the first place by looking at patient demographic information and then analysing that against medication data and condition data, etc., to come up with a finite data set of people that we thought would be at risk. So there's one example of us joining various different kind of data sets to come up with something that would be of value to the service and to the populace in general. In other areas, we've looked at, for example, combining COVID infection data with things like how people are using the 111 service. So correlating those two different sets of information to give directors of public health and other areas a more holistic view of what's happening in their area. So COVID kind of test information is kind of one thing, but we know that not everybody gets tested. I think it would be great if everybody did, but the ability to give them more intelligence as to what people are looking for within a particular area and to be able to cut that information down at really quite granular levels. In some cases, we're now providing that data down at postcode level. The ability to join those elements is really helping the service sort of fight the pandemic at this point in time. And I think it has shown that NHS Digital increasingly has a role to play, given its statutory responsibility to collect all this data, to look at what insight that we can derive from joining some of those data sets together. And that's not something that we have typically done that much of in the past. And your second part of that question was then around what does that mean in terms of our infrastructure and the skills that we need within the organisation. So it does mean that we need to strengthen our data engineering capabilities. We have been very good at collecting large volumes of data and transforming that and sending it out. But the ability to collect kind of large data sets and understand how to join them and to drive kind of insight from it means that you have to have a very strong kind of data science, analytics and data engineering capabilities. And those are areas that we have identified through this situation that we need to make improvements on. We've already started to put those in play.
Brilliant. I mean, super interesting then. Now, as you know, the theme for the conference is about creating value from volatility. And the topic for today is about finding opportunities in new realities that we find ourselves living through. For all of the challenges that NHS Digital has faced this year, you've also accomplished a lot, and we've heard, I'm sure, what is just the tip of the iceberg. But could you share some of the lessons learned and skills gained in the last few months that you think will be super important and benefit the organisation going forward?
So, I mean, I think one of the main things that we learned in this period that the world is less predictable than we thought it was, as with many public sector organisations, we operate under a cycle where we have annual business cases that are part of kind of 3-year long-term kind of program business cases, and under normal circumstances that may not be ideal, but where you have a degree of control of what's happening, you can work within those within those constraints. And I think what the pandemic has shown is that at the height of the pandemic, quite often we didn't know what was going to be happening in 2-3 weeks' time, let alone what was going to be happening in 6 or 9 months. So it has taught us that we don't have control necessarily over what's happening, and we have to have a delivery model that extends to clinical systems, that allows us to be fundamentally more nimble and agile than typically organizations have been with things like clinical systems. We've always been very nimble and agile with some of our citizen facing services, but to give you an example of one of our products, the NHS Pathways product, which is the clinical algorithms that underpin the 111 telephony service. Typically, those don't change that regularly. So, we would operate in a 3-monthly release cycle relating to those products. We learned during the pandemic that, or we were forced to operate in the pandemic, where we were releasing those algorithms sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes several times a day. So we have learned that we need to set ourselves up organizationally so that we can deliver at speed. And I think that is a key element of what I'm here to do, is to make sure that all our services can deliver or release at the cadence that they need to, and that cadence may change over time, and we need to be able to kind of dial that up and dial that down as we need to. The second thing that we've learned is that we need to be better around reacting to kind of unpredictability. So we need to have a better understanding of what's happening out in the field. We need to have a better understanding of what the data is telling us, and to be able to pivot very, very quickly to change the work that we're doing to respond to that. So that ability to release and the ability to get intelligence around what's happening out in the field are things that we have fundamentally learned that we need to do. The third element that is now forms part of everything that we do is building our services for resilience. So going forwards, we make sure that we thought the majority of our services were fully elastic and capable of reacting to wildly fluctuating levels of demand, and we thought our 111 service was like that. But we got found out when something very, very unpredictable hit us. So all our services now, we build with that unpredictability in mind. So we build effectively as if we are in a hostile environment. We make sure that our services can scale in a fully elastic manner. We recently had some of our services that were fully elastic, went down because Amazon had an issue in a single availability zone. So we now need to build our services so that they can operate across multiple availability zones, because it's not acceptable for frontline clinical services to not operate for any kind of protected period. So in terms of what we've learned from volatility and the value that we will take from that, so it's fundamentally accelerated the journey that we were on to make sure that all our services can release value out into the service as quickly as possible. It's taught us that we need to be more reactive and not more reactive, but we need to understand what our data is telling us and to be able to pivot very, very quickly if we need to do that. And the third thing that it's taught us is that we need to build services that are fundamentally resilient in terms of whatever the service can or whatever the environment can throw at us. And I think if we take that into the way that we operate going forwards as we come out of the pandemic, that will fundamentally move, I think, NHS IT and digital delivery into a different space. So it will move all our services up to the very high bar that we operate in some areas, and it will mean that we can deliver the maximum value into the service. The time taken from a need being expressed to that value being released out into the service will fundamentally have been short-circuited, both in terms of time and the amount of money that will cost for that value to be released. So it will fundamentally move us into a different place.
Thanks for that, Ben. You've talked about part of the future strategy, and part of the reason why you are at NHS Digital is about helping the organization make the shift from a project mindset to a product mindset for services that you deliver. Could you talk us a little bit about that, and particularly why it's important to the NHS to make that shift?
So I think as part of making a shift from projects to products, we're fundamentally trying to shift thinking from short term to thinking long term about the things that we build, and making an investment both in terms of the technology, but also the people and the processes that relate to those. We're also trying to shift the focus from delivering things to delivering business results. And these are things that you would typically associate with product management. So from my perspective, I see the role of product management as being maximizing the value that the services can provide out to the consumer of those services, whilst minimizing the time and the cost associated with delivering those services. And I think when you operate under a project mindset, it's quite often easy to lose sight of that equation. So quite typically, the scope is defined, up front. There's a finite, cost envelope associated with delivering that scope. And quite often you don't make some of the long-term investments that you would need to make in those products and services, because it doesn't make sense in the context of that finite business case. But I think if you shift the mindset to thinking around these products and these services are going to be around for a long period of time, and actually what we're here to do is to manage that equation of value delivery versus cost and time or efficiency of delivering that value, some of those things start to be questioned. So you would say, well, why am I doing this bit of work when the data is telling me that I should be doing that, a different piece of work? And it's much easier to pivot and to focus on the things that are most valuable for you when you start to think more about things from a sustainable and a long-term perspective. And that's not just in terms of the things that you do to the service, but it's also about how you approach your teams and your processes as well. So you're always trying to think about, how can I make my, my deployment pipelines? How can I make them more effective? How can I, upskill, my team members so they've got, so that they can potentially do more with the same amount of people, or for example, we can be much more efficient in the way that we deliver. How do I, make my team happier and kind of work better together? So these are all things that you start to think about quite intensively under a product regime that I think sometimes don't get the attention that they deserve when you're typically focused on projects which tend to have a shorter lifespan than thinking about long-term products and services and sustainability in mind. So it's really that's what we're trying to achieve with the shift from projects to products. It's about bringing into play a real close focus on that equation of maximizing the value that we deliver to the business, whilst maximizing the efficiency with which we deliver that value.
A huge thanks, Ben, for stepping in today and for sharing such valuable insights with us. Please tune in later for the last session of Thoughtworks Live 2020 to hear from Simon Badley, CEO of market-leading insurance software business OpenGI.